Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to get into something that I think we all struggle with, the whole optimism versus pessimism thing.
Yeah.
And specifically when it comes to money.
Right.
Like, I think we can all relate to that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's such a fascinating paradox because, like, we know logically that progress happens.
Yeah.
Like, things generally improve over time.
Right.
But then there's this, like, pull towards pessimism.
Right.
This idea that maybe things are actually going downhill.
Well, and I think our guide for today's conversation is really going to help us to understand Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. We're focusing specifically on chapter 17, called The Seduction of Pessimism.
Oh, wow.
And even the title of the chapter just had me hooked.
Yeah, well, he kicks things off with a quote that I think really sets the stage.
Okay.
It's from historian Deirdre McCloskey. And she says, "For reasons I have never understood, people like to hear that the world is going to hell."
It's so true.
It's
true. Like, it's almost like we're drawn to those worst case scenarios.
Right.
But why is that?
Yeah.
Why does pessimism have such a hold on us?
Well, Housel argues that, a big part of it is just that pessimism often feels smarter.
Yeah.
It feels more insightful.
Right.
It can seem more grounded in reality than optimism.
Okay.
Which sometimes, comes across as naive.
Right.
Or even like a sales pitch.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Like, if somebody's, like, super optimistic, you're like, okay, are you just trying to sell me something?
Exactly.
But if somebody's predicting doom and gloom,
right,
you think, like, oh, they must have some inside knowledge.
Right. They've got the real scoot here.
I really know what's going on.
Yeah, and this plays into, like, our evolutionary wiring, too.
Right.
Like, loss aversion is such a powerful force.
Yeah.
We're naturally just more sensitive to potential threats than we are to opportunities.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So from a survival standpoint, it makes sense to pay more attention to the negative.
Well, and how does that then play out in the real world?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to money decisions.
Yeah, well, Housel uses this really interesting example from a 1999 article in the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, wow.
Where they predicted that the U.S. would break into 6 pieces by 2010.
Okay, wait.
Due to internal conflicts.
6 pieces.
6 pieces, yeah.
That's very specific.
Very specific, and obviously that did not happen.
Obviously, yeah.
But what's so fascinating about this is, even though this prediction was wildly off base, it likely caught people's attention. Yeah. Like, it's a dramatic narrative. Right. It plays into our fears.
Yeah.
And this type of sensationalized pessimism isn't limited to just geopolitics. It pops up in the financial world all the time.
Okay, so are you saying, like, we should just ignore all negative predictions? Like, I mean, some risks are real, right?
It's not about ignoring reality.
Okay.
It's about understanding the context.
Okay.
And Housel contrasts this tendency with the story of the Japanese miracle.
Okay.
So after World War II, Japan was in ruins, right?
Yeah.
Facing famine and economic collapse.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Like, if you look at pictures from that time, it's just bleak.
Right.
And yet within a few decades,
right,
Japan became one of the world's leading economies. Yeah. It's this incredible story of resilience and growth.
Wow.
But it's not the kind of narrative that grabs headlines.
Right.
In the same way that, like, a doomsday prediction does.
So we're more likely to remember the really dramatic predictions of doom.
Right.
Even if they turn out to be completely wrong.
Exactly.
Than we are to remember the stories of quiet, steady progress.
Yeah, and that's why I think understanding this seduction of pessimism is so important.
Yeah.
Because think about it, like, if someone had predicted Japan's economic miracle back in the late 1940s, right, they probably would have been dismissed as, like, naive or overly optimistic.
You're crazy.
Yeah. You have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, that'll never happen.
Right.
And this makes me think about, like, all these, so-called experts that we see today who gain huge followings by constantly predicting economic collapse or, some other disaster.
Right.
Are they really insightful?
Yeah.
Or are they just playing to our deepest fears?
Well, Housel quotes John Stuart Mill.
Okay.
Who back in the 1840s wrote, "The person who despairs when others hope is admired by a large class of people as a sage." Wow. That's a really interesting observation. Yes. And it makes you wonder how much of what we perceive as wisdom is actually just pessimism in disguise.
It's almost like we've been conditioned to associate negativity with intelligence.
Right.
Like the more pessimistic you are, the smarter you must be.
The more you must know.
Right. You must have the inside scoop. Okay. But that's dangerous.
And that's a dangerous trap.
Right. Especially when it comes to money.
Especially when it comes to money.
Yeah. Okay. I'm starting to see how this could like really affect our financial choices.
Right.
Like we might miss out on opportunities because we're too busy bracing for the worst.
Exactly. And Housel points out that progress often happens too slowly to notice.
Okay.
But setbacks, like a stock market crash or a job loss, happen too quickly to ignore.
Of course, yeah.
So our perception of like how things are going can be skewed by these like really dramatic events, even if the overall trend is positive.
And that makes me think about the example you mentioned earlier with the Wright brothers.
Yes.
The Detroit Free Press declared airplanes impossible 6 months before the Wright brothers' first successful flight.
Exactly.
Like, how could they have known?
And even after that flight, people continued to underestimate the significance of their invention.
It's wild.
Like, progress can be so subtle, so incremental, that it often doesn't register in our minds.
Right.
The same way that like a sudden dramatic event does.
So how do we apply this understanding to our own financial lives? How do we avoid getting swept up in all the pessimism and make smart choices for the long term?
Yep.
Okay, so we've established that pessimism can be pretty seductive, especially when it comes to money.
Yeah.
But how do we actually combat that?
Right.
How do we make sure that, we're not letting those negative biases just cloud our judgment when it comes to financial decisions?
Well, I think one of the key things Housel emphasizes is the importance of having a long-term perspective. Right. It's about recognizing that, volatility and setbacks are a normal part of the process.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to investing.
Easier said than done, though, right?
Absolutely.
Like when the market takes a dive and your portfolio is shrinking, it's hard not to panic.
Yeah, it definitely is.
So how do you actually...
But that's where having a clear investment strategy that you've thought through and that you're comfortable with becomes absolutely crucial. Okay. Don't let those short-term market fluctuations derail your long-term goals.
So it's less about trying to time the market perfectly and more about just having that plan in place and sticking to it even when things get a little rocky.
Yeah, and this is where I think understanding that historical context that we were talking about earlier can really help.
Okay.
Because when you zoom out and you look at the long-term trends, you see that the market has always trended upwards over time.
Right.
Despite the inevitable dips and crashes along the way.
Dips are scary.
They are.
Like how do you actually stay focused on that bigger picture when it feels like everything's going wrong?
Well, one thing that can be helpful is to actually view those market dips as potential buying opportunities. Because when prices go down, it can be a chance to buy more of the assets that you believe in at a lower price.
Oh, so instead of freaking out when the market drops, I should be thinking, okay, this is my chance to like snag some bargains.
It's a mindset shift for sure. And it circles back to that idea of like managing our emotions when it comes to money.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing those ingrained biases that we have, like our tendency towards pessimism, and actively working to counter them.
And I remember we talked about the allure of those so-called experts who predict doom and gloom. It seems like they're almost preying on our anxieties to make us more likely to make like an impulsive decision based on fear.
And those impulsive decisions often end up hurting us financially in the long run.
Right, of course. Yeah.
So it's always a good idea to kind of question those predictions, especially when they're coming from somebody who stands to benefit from our fear and uncertainty.
Yeah. Okay, so it's not about ignoring negativity altogether. But it's about being discerning.
Exactly.
About the information that we consume.
Absolutely. And I think this discerning mindset can apply to our everyday money decisions as well.
Okay.
Think about how we often react to a potential expense.
Right.
Our first instinct might be, can I afford this?
Totally.
Which comes from a place of fear and scarcity.
Yeah. I do that.
Right.
I immediately start thinking about all the things that I might have to sacrifice if I make this purchase.
But what if we flip the script?
Okay.
Instead of focusing on what we might lose, what if we ask ourselves, is this worth it?
Okay.
Or how will this enrich my life?
That's interesting. It's a much more positive way of framing it.
Right.
Yeah, it shifts the focus from fear to opportunity.
Exactly.
But let's be real. Yeah. There are times when pessimism is warranted, right?
Of course.
Not every opportunity is a good one. And sometimes caution is the smarter approach.
There's a difference between healthy skepticism,
right,
which can help us make sound decisions,
okay,
and blind negativity, which can paralyze us and prevent us from taking advantage of good opportunities.
So how do we know when to trust our gut feeling?
Right.
And when to kind of push back against those pessimistic impulses?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it brings us to another important point that Housel makes.
Okay.
It's not just about avoiding pessimism.
Right.
It's also about being aware of the potential pitfalls.
Of excessive optimism.
Okay,
so we need to find that sweet spot.
Right.
Between being cautiously optimistic and realistically prepared.
Exactly. It's about having a balanced perspective.
Okay.
One that allows us to see both the potential risks and rewards in any given situation.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But to be honest, it also sounds really hard.
It's definitely a skill that takes practice and conscious effort. It requires us to really challenge our ingrained thought patterns and emotional responses, especially those related to money.
Right.
It's not easy, but it's essential for making sound financial decisions.
Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of both pessimism and excessive optimism, but how do we actually cultivate that sense of balance?
Yeah.
We've talked about how pessimism can really distort our view of money.
Right.
And how unchecked optimism can also kind of lead us astray.
Right.
So for this last part, let's get practical.
Yeah.
What are some tangible steps we can take to navigate this complex financial terrain?
Well, I think first, building a strong financial foundation is key.
Okay.
Housel talks about, the importance of having an emergency fund,
right,
paying down high interest debt, investing regularly.
Okay, so even if you're feeling pessimistic about the future,
right,
just having those foundational elements in place can give you a sense of security.
Absolutely.
And control.
Yeah, it's about taking those practical steps to protect yourself, regardless of what the market does.
And even if those steps seem overwhelming.
Right.
Remember that starting small is better than not starting at all.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Kind of takes the pressure off a little bit.
Yeah, you don't have to do everything perfectly right away.
Right.
Even setting aside a small amount each week can make a big difference over time.
It's like that old saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Right? Every little bit counts.
Another important piece I think that Housel highlights is understanding your own risk tolerance.
Okay.
Not everyone is comfortable with the same level of risk.
Right.
And that's okay.
It's like some people love riding roller coasters.
Right.
And other people prefer a nice, gentle carousel. And neither one is right or wrong.
Right.
It's just about knowing, what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, when it comes to investing, it's about finding investments that align with your personal goals,
right,
your time frame, and your comfort level.
And if you're feeling unsure about where to start, or maybe you're feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of investment options out there, working with a financial advisor can be helpful.
Absolutely. A good advisor can help you create a plan that takes into account your unique circumstances and goals.
Okay, so we've talked about the practical steps.
Right.
Building that financial foundation. Understanding risk tolerance.
Yeah.
Maybe even seeking guidance from a professional.
Right.
But what about the emotional side of things?
Right.
That's where things get really tricky.
Yeah, you're right. Managing those emotions is often the most challenging part.
Right, and this is where I think Housel's emphasis on the long-term mindset comes into play. It's about not letting those short-term fluctuations derail your long-term plan.
Exactly. It's about focusing on that bigger picture. Remembering that market volatility is normal.
Right.
And staying the course even when things get bumpy.
Oh, okay.
And this is where I think those foundational steps that we talked about earlier can make a big difference.
Oh, okay.
Because when you know you have that solid financial base, it's easier to kind of weather those inevitable storms.
So it's almost like having that strong foundation gives you the emotional resilience to ride out those ups and downs.
Exactly. It's like having a safety net that allows you to be a little bit more daring, a little bit more optimistic, without feeling like you're putting everything at risk.
Yeah. Okay. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. But developing that long-term mindset, especially when we're constantly bombarded with news, that can feel very urgent and immediate. Yeah. That takes real effort.
It does it. One thing that can be helpful is to focus on what you can control.
Okay.
You can't control the market, but you can control your savings rate. You can control your investment choices. And you can control how you react to events.
Okay.
So focusing on those controllable elements can help you feel more empowered even when things are uncertain.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
And it circles back to that idea of balancing optimism and pessimism.
Right.
It's not about pretending that everything will always be perfect.
Yeah.
But it's about recognizing that setbacks are a part of life. And a part of investing.
Right.
And not letting them derail you completely.
Precisely. It's about being prepared for those setbacks, having a plan in place, and trusting that over time things tend to work out.
So to wrap this all up, what are the key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with today?
I think first remember that pessimism, while seductive, is not always accurate. It's important to question those negative predictions and look for evidence of progress, even when it's subtle or incremental.
And second,
focus on what you can control. Build that strong financial foundation. Understand your risk tolerance and develop that long-term mindset.
Okay.
These are the tools that will help you navigate the financial world with confidence.
Right.
Regardless of your natural inclination towards optimism or pessimism.
That's great advice. And to add one final thought.
Okay.
Something to ponder as you continue on your own financial journey. We've talked about how pessimism can distort our view of the world.
Right.
But what about the opposite? Extreme blind optimism.
That's a great question.
I guess it's like anything else.
Yeah.
Too much of a good thing can be just as bad as too much of a bad thing.
Right. So as you learn more about personal finance, consider seeking out diverse perspectives, challenging your own assumptions, and finding that balance between healthy skepticism and being open to opportunity.
That's a great point to end on. It's a journey.
It is.
And the more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to make those sound decisions.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the seduction of pessimism.
My pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring.